When you think about super successful businesses that are selling through the roof, like Heinz or Mattel, you think about a great product, a cool brand, and brilliant marketing. But there's a secret. The business behind the business, making selling simple for them and buying simple for their customers. For millions of businesses, that business is Shopify. Upgrade your business and get the same checkout as Heinz and Mattel. Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/promo, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/promo to upgrade your selling today. Shopify.com/promo.
What is Dax are you?
Tracking all our cars on Carvana Value Tracker on all our devices? Yes, Kristen, yes I am.
Well, I've been looking for my phone for...
In Dax's domain, we see all. So we always know what our cars are worth.
All of them?
All of them. Value surge, trucks up 3.9%.
That's a great offer.
I know. Sell?
Sell.
Track your car's value with Carvana Value Tracker today.
It's March 3rd, 1861, and another remarkable event is about to be uncovered by Ariel, Rebecca, and Ali, the Retrospectors.
What have you done today? If the answer is pray and have breakfast, then so far you've had a similar morning to Emperor Alexander II, today in history in 1861. If, however, you're not about to liberate 22 million of your people, then I'm afraid you're far from the Tsar, because it was on this day that he granted freedom to the serfs of Russia.
Yeah, and the emancipation of the serfs was actually the product of 5 years' work by thousands of officials. And when it was finally presented, the Emancipation Statute, which accompanied the proclamation, had 22 separate measures whose details filled 360 closely printed pages. So it was a huge body of work.
Yeah, so we're now in the middle of the 19th century, and Russia was keen to look like a modern European state and a world power, and serfdom increasingly looked like a medieval relic. You know, it was making them a little bit backwards on the world stage. It was a strange contrast because on one hand Russia was modernizing, but on the other hand it was based in this feudal system. So by this point about half of factory workers were serfs, and it was increasingly at odds with modern life. But actually moving towards emancipation was kind of a daunting and very delicate matter. This was a nation where 1/3 of the population was serfs, about 40 million people. Plus, you know, Tsars through history had really relied on the support of the nobility, most of whom had vast estates worked by serfs. The real wake-up call was the defeat of Russia in the Crimean War in 1854. Russia was portrayed as a sluggish, backwards nation made up of, you know, complacent, dissolute aristocrats ruling over a mass of puny and ignorant peasants who'd been the conscripts in the army that had been defeated. And 2 years after this, Alexander II announced his intention to break down the serfdom system. He told Russian aristocrats, "It is better to begin to destroy serfdom from above than to wait until that time when it begins to destroy itself from below." And everyone knew what he was referring to, because over the past 40 years, there had been more than 700 peasant uprisings across Russia.
Yes. Okay, so who were the serfs then? Because I think people, particularly listening in the USA, will think, oh, they're like slaves. They're like the slaves that we had in America. They're not quite. On paper, the freedoms that serfs already had were greater than slaves had in the United States, because there was already a ban on selling serfs without land. So if you were a serf and you lived in a place, your family would always live in that place. You'd be sold along with that land. You couldn't be sold to someone else to go and work somewhere else. Although, you know, how much stuff was being documented, particularly the trade in young women, virgins, you know, all of that was still going on, even though officially it was banned. They were considered to be people, not things, is another crucial distinction. They were baptized Russian Orthodox Christians. They, of course, weren't of a different race to the people that were their masters. And so they were afforded a few more respects. They had some time off. They laboured for their masters 3 days a week, but the rest of the time they were free to work for their own benefit. And Russian law had already mandated certain minimum allotments of land for each serf family, because they were often on huge estates. You know, it's not like they were just living in someone's house being a private slave. Often they would never meet their masters, who were landlords who lived in St. Petersburg or Moscow, and they would operate as their own family, just under the ownership of someone else. Although, as a result of that, they did have to pay tax. And it was the fact that serfs were paying tax which was causing a lot of revolutionary thought. We're funding the government and we don't get to benefit from it.
Yeah, you might think that serfs were created so as to create this direct control from Tsar over the peasantry. But actually, it was all about controlling the nobility, because Russian serfdom dated back to this 1649 legal code that gave landowners total authority over the peasants who lived on their land. And the purpose behind granting that exact connection between landowners and the people who lived there was to make the nobles dependent on, and therefore loyal to, the Tsar. So they were basically building up this connection between the upper classes, the lower classes that they controlled, but more importantly, the Tsar who sat over the lot of them.
And the precise conditions of serfdom changed a lot over the centuries. Until the early modern era, it didn't really need much in the way of enforcement because feudalism was the way things were. In the 1500s and 1600s, this did start to change. This is when we start to see more restrictive, codified, harsher laws brought in to bind peasants legally to their master's estate, restricting them or even totally prohibiting them from moving, and laws over their personal lives. For instance, until 1812, serfs couldn't marry serfs from other estates because it was thought, this is going to complicate things. At the same time, though, chattel slavery did begin to be phased out. Medieval times, there had been actual slavery in Russia as well, and this was phased out, but at the same time, the conditions of the peasants began to resemble those of the slaves a little bit more. As you mentioned, if technically you belong to the land, but you're also not allowed to move away from the land. Really, the difference between serfdom and slavery is on a bit of a knife edge. And, as we've discussed, some serfs never even met their landlords. They were just distant people who didn't personally intervene in their lives at all. Others were extremely notorious for their brutality and for their persecution of their serfs, because their masters could punish them with anything pretty much short of death, including banishing them to Siberia.
But still, the evolution away from serfs may have taken another 50 years were it not for the fact that we got Alexander II as emperor. He became known as the reformist Tsar. He'd had a liberal education and came in wanting to make changes, not just to serfdom, but also to the military. So he enforced conscription for all social classes. Before then, it had just been for the peasantry. For the judicial system, which he made simpler and more transparent. But it's this emancipation of the serfs that is probably his greatest legacy, not necessarily because of what it did for Russia, but also the influence that it had in America.
Yeah, there are interesting parallels between Russia and the US. In the 1860s, Russia and the US's leaders, President Abraham Lincoln and Alexander, were on these quite similar paths. Of course, in Alexander's case, it was kind of this broad culture war between the westernizers and the Slavophiles, people trying to move more towards the West and those who wanted to maintain Russia. But, this sort of momentum to end serfdom growing in Russia was a kind of parallel to the abolitionists who were fighting to end slavery in the US, and proponents of both movements really pointed to the example set by such European powers as France and Britain and Denmark, all of which had abolished slavery in 1848.
Yeah, and the parallels continued after the emancipation as well, because a lot like what happened in the American South, in a sense, the freed serfs were actually materially worse off than before in a lot of cases. As serfs, they had a piece of land to live and farm on, and the law did oblige landlords to provide their serfs with food in times of famine. Now they were expected to take care of themselves with no resources, in a system that was almost impossibly stacked against them. Unsurprisingly, the landlord's vision for emancipation, which they had put forward in that 360-page Emancipation Statute, was pretty landlord-friendly. Landowners no longer controlled their personal lives in the same way, but peasants now officially belonged to mirs, those self-governing communities you mentioned. They were responsible for fulfilling state obligations such as collecting tax and supplying conscripts, and all of this was intended to keep the countryside and the peasantry under tight control.
Hindsight sort of suggests that emancipation was essentially a failure because, exactly what you're saying, Rebecca, it raised expectations among serfs and then massively dashed them. But the problem was that for Slavophiles, emancipation went too far, for those people who wanted Russia to cling to its old ways and to avoid the corruption that came with Western modernity. But then for people who did want to westernize and modernize, it didn't go far enough. And so those progressives were disappointed too. So it was kind of this solution that pleased absolutely nobody.
Meanwhile, as I was suggesting earlier, it did sort of embarrass the Americans to take action perhaps sooner. Coincidentally, this day in history that we're talking about was the eve of Lincoln's inauguration. And commentators would often point out what the Tsar was up to in an attempt to urge Lincoln on. Horace Greeley, editor of the New York Tribune, wrote, "The manifesto of the Tsar is throughout in most striking contrast to the recent manifestos of the leaders of the rebel slaveholders in this country," talking about the Confederates. "With brutal coolness, they doom a whole race to eternal bondage. The Russian autocrat, on the other hand, admits that man has certain rights." Sort of just making the point that it's embarrassing, really, for America to be founded on the basis that all men are created equal and still have slavery. Southern critics of Lincoln started calling him the American Tsar in a direct reference to Alexander.
Well, another parallel as well is that in the end, both leaders were assassinated, although Lincoln's assassin was acting on reactionary motives, and in Alexander's case, he was assassinated by a revolutionary leftist group. Which is kind of ironic, considering that...
Yeah, what more do you want?
Yeah, it was probably the most significant liberalization of Russian society in history to that point. But I think it probably does also speak to the fact that we alluded to earlier, which was that the Tsar was acting fundamentally to protect the status quo because he saw the writing was on the wall for slavery, serfdom, whatever you want to call it.
And was literally lauding it up. I mean, the day he was assassinated, he was in a bombproof carriage gifted to him by Napoleon III.
Yeah, exactly. He wasn't acting for liberal motives. He was acting because he realized that there had been 700 peasant uprisings in his lifetime. So he was acting to protect the status quo rather than dismantle it.
If you're wondering, by the way, how a bomb-proof carriage still managed to result in his death, it did protect him against the first bomb, which was chucked under the wheels, but not Strike 2, which was a bomb thrown directly at his feet. There's only so much a carriage can do to protect you from that.
He had a bomb-proof carriage rather than a bombs-proof carriage. Should have read the fine print, man.
Now,
this episode first aired last year exclusively to members of Club Retrospectors.
Join today and unlock a new episode this Sunday.
Patreon.com/Retrospectors